Desperate times call for desperate measures. Welcome to Walking Through the Word for today, where we are in John chapter 6, and we're really watching and listening to some very difficult words from Jesus. Now, before we get into those, I want to make a correction a little bit for what I said yesterday when I talked about cannibalism being against. The truth is, there's nothing actually in the Old Testament that specifically says that cannibalism is bad. However, we do know that this is the case, but because of the value of lifeblood, because of the value of those things, and the recognition of the pagan practices of eating children. God warns, though, that when desperate times come, the people will choose to do these things that are considered abhorrent, absolutely gross and detestable. Leviticus 26, God warns that this is going to happen when they become desperate. He says in Leviticus 26:29, "Further, you will eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters you will eat." Now, before that sounds like, oh my goodness, Jeremy, did they really do this? Sadly enough, they did. In 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 28 through 29, the king said to her, this is a conversation during the siege of Samaria, and a woman answered, "This woman said to me, give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, give your son that we may eat him, but she has hidden her son." Now, these are difficult words. These are words that nobody likes to read and nobody likes to think about because they are so detestable. These were not words of good prophecy. These were words of dire prophecy that came down. And so the people of Israel recognized and understood that it was a horrible and detestable thing to eat the flesh of another person. That was something that pagans and cult groups did, not the people of Israel. So when Jesus in John chapter 6 is talking about being the bread of life, the people are really disturbed by this. But rather than kind of clarifying, Jesus actually makes it a little bit more difficult for them. In verse 53, in verse 52, they say, well, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And at this point, Jesus could have said, look, guys, I'm not talking about my flesh. But he didn't. Instead, in verse 52, he says, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever." This is difficult. And as a matter of fact, the disciples in verse 60 say, this is hard teaching. Who can accept it? But again, we have to understand that Jesus is not talking about his actual physical flesh. This is metaphorically speaking, so people can understand that he brings life, whereas everything else in this world eventually leads to death. This is why Jesus said just a few verses before, "Whoever believes in me will be saved." This is the flesh and the blood that Jesus is talking about. But he's also trying to help them understand that the sacrifice and the cost that comes with following Jesus. You see, a lot of times in the church, we don't like to talk about the difficult parts. We talk about follow Jesus and everything will be happy. Yay! But that's not what Jesus promises. In fact, Jesus promises the exact opposite. If you follow me, you will be hated as the world hates me. See, following Jesus is difficult. But it's not just difficult because the world hates you. We have to remember that we are in the world as well. And there are things that we naturally want to do that fly in the face of what God has for us. As a matter of fact, pretty much everything that we do is opposite of what God would have for us. We have to be willing to sacrifice that part so that we might follow Jesus. We have to be willing to take the things that he faced and the breaking of his body and the losing of his blood. We have to be willing to become that sacrifice as well. As he says, take up your cross and follow me. That's what he says in Luke chapter 6, verses 23 and 24. He says, "Whoever would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." We have to do this every single day. This is the sacrifice. When Jesus says, pick up the cross, everybody knew that the cross was offensive. Everyone knew that the cross meant humiliation. It meant death. These are the words that Jesus is saying here. Are we willing to drink the blood and eat the flesh? Are we willing to sacrifice what we want so that God may be glorified? But in doing so, we may be saved. This is what Jesus is talking about, and it is hard teaching. Not because it's talking about cannibalism, but because it's talking about the sacrifice that must be made in order to follow Jesus. Jesus says it is worth it, but it is also very hard.